Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, and welcome to everybody listening to this UK IBC webcast. This is part of a series of webcasts that we are doing. You'll probably have seen our webcasts so far on education. We've also covered the food and drink industry. And as I say, this is a continued process that we'll be doing. So again, any ideas for any future webcasts, we'll be delighted to host those as well. So we're glad to welcome our colleagues and guests from all over the UK and also India. So thank you very much for attending. This webcast, we're going to be looking at how politics and regulation will transform India's business risk and investment landscapes. And I'm delighted to have two colleagues here and members of UK IBC. They are from Control Risks. So we have James and Amit, both from either side of the living bridge. So we have James here, who is representing the London office, and Amit, who is representing the India office there in Delhi. In terms of how this is going to work, we're going to do brief introductions, then we'll have a presentation. At any time during the presentation, feel free to ask any questions. So they will be done through your keyboard. You'll see a pop-up that will allow you to ask questions. You ask those questions, and then we'll be able to answer those at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll introduce you over to James, who'll give you a brief introduction of Control Risks. So, James.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody joining today. Thank you also to the UK IBC for hosting Amit and I. As Chris said, I'm James and I've been at Control Risks for around 14 years. Before relocating back to sunny England, I was based in India, where I lived and worked for 6 years for Control Risks, running our business there. And actually handing over to Amit, I'm pleased to say, at the end of 2017. I've worked in a variety of other jurisdictions for the company, including Russia. But my role now is to oversee our global cyber security business across the firm, and very much act as a representative for everything that Amit and his excellent team in India do in the UK and more broadly across Europe. For those of you who are not familiar with Control Risks, we're a global risk consultancy. We've been around now for around 45 years. We help organizations in simple terms across 4 main areas of risk: political and regulatory, fraud and corruption, and security and digital risk. We have a global business that spans the world, 2,500 employees and around 37 offices. Before going into any more detail, I think what I'll do is hand over to Amit to provide a bit more colour both on our business in India, but most importantly, some of the changes that we are now seeing underway in the Indian business and political environment. So, Amit, over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Chris, and the rest of the UK IBC team. It's a pleasure to be speaking to all of you folks. As James mentioned, we have a long history in India. Over the last couple of decades, we've lived and worked out of India. Our teams we've got about 40 people in the business now, full service organization, which covers the length and breadth of operational risks that companies face up to in India. Fundamentally, we have the tricky job of speaking to you about all the things that might hold your business plans back. That's effectively a broad phrase to kind of think about when you think about what Control Risks does in India. But coming to the topic at hand, we've spent a lot of time responding to a lot of questions by a lot of clients, partners, and within the organization on what the latest political realignment or alignment or reaffirmation, if you will, in India means. With the polls in 2019 bringing Mr. Modi back into power for his second term, and we kind of would start with a little bit of a step back at what this kind of a mandate means. For those of you who watch or read Indian history, not since 1971, read modern Indian history, not since 1971, on the back of the war of Bangladesh independence, when Mrs. Gandhi came back to power, has there been an incumbent party coming back in majority. So that just kind of shows you 50 odd years since something like this happened. Now, contrast that with the fact that BJP as a party in its latest avatar really started in 1980. Before that, they were in multiple guises. It was only in 1980 that the party as it currently is started off. And in the last 40 years, they've had, this is their kind of fifth significant attempt to coming to power. And the trajectory over the last 40 years has been one of evolution, where BJP has become more and more adept at the art of governance. And starting with the first 13-day government in 96, and then the 13-month government in 98, and then 99 to 2004, where Mr. Vajpayee did the full term, leading up to Mr. Modi coming in and becoming the second BJP politician to become the Prime Minister of India, and now reaffirming his position as probably the party's foremost leader, having won that re-election with such a resounding majority. The numbers, if you are, and we can have a separate discussion on that, are alarmingly similar to the numbers that Mrs. Gandhi again won in 1971 as compared to 1967. And the parallels don't just stop there. But we also are seeing the emergence of BJP as a very savvy very mature political player, given the emphasis that they have put on not just center, ruling at the center, but also and in the states. And as any India watcher knows, India is a land of, well, as many states, a million stories, but certainly the 28 now states, and the real balance of power probably resides in the states. And under Mr. Modi, who of course comes from one of those states, Gujarat, he understands the importance of keeping state legislations in control, and puts a great deal of emphasis on all of them. Which is why in the end of 2018, when his party lost Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh, it was seen as a body blow. But clearly he's recovered from that and has in fact grown in strength, confidence, and has taken on from there. So what does 2019 mean? Is it an alignment of stars? We think that it's certainly foretold a couple of things. One, the prospects of improved state and federal cooperation. I think on the back of a lot of the elections that are coming up, Maharashtra, Haryana, Delhi in the front end of next year, we'll see BJP consolidating its position as in state politics as well. But equally, reforms tend to be referred to very often as potentially being high on the agenda, because there is that political capital that Mr. Modi will likely use to press ahead with much needed changes in the way that the society, the economy, businesses, indeed politics itself works in India. But fundamental to all of that is the kind of defining principle that BJP under Modi has now replaced Congress as the natural pole of Indian politics. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, especially with respect to what that means on their ability to kind of run and drive, drive legislation through both houses of parliament, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. In 2020, BJP's Rajya Sabha, BJP and its allies the NDA will effectively be in a simple majority in Rajya Sabha, and that is a significant inflection point in their evolution as a party of reckoning. But talking about elections 2019, the conversations leading up to it didn't quite foretell as much of a strong outcome for the government, for the ruling party. Truth be told, we as control risks have also presented a fact that presented scenarios where Mr. Modi would retain power, we felt, but would be diminished in his numbers. But of course, he proved all the kind of naysayers wrong, and came back very strongly. And we think that kind of boils down to four prominent legs on which he kind of based his communications and his campaigning through the 7 phases of elections. One was one of strong nationalism. I think Pulwama, as unfortunate as it was as an incident, with about 40 odd CRPF Jawans losing their life to a terrorist attack, meant that the nation coalesced around the idea of muscular international presence and kind of hitting back, if you will. And Mr. Modi is extremely adept at that. He was also extremely good at messaging and had a very well-managed campaign. There were 7 different messages delivered through the 7 broad buckets of messaging. It wasn't one size fits all. He spoke differently in Bihar as compared to Bengal. For instance, he spoke differently in Karnataka as compared to Maharashtra, and so on and so forth. The opposition disarray helped. The opposition also made it very much a presidential style election, which helped Mr. Modi in hindsight, because there was very clear daylight between him and any other potential for a prime ministerial position in India leading into May 23rd. And of course, I think not to belittle the pro-poor, pro-welfare reforms that Modi 1.0 between 2014 and 19 have unleashed. A lot of these programs kind of have had their fair share of brickbats for not delivering as much as they committed to. But the fact is that people started seeing a lot more gas connections, a lot better electricity connectivity to villages even near them, if not to their villages, as also other benefits coming to them, which they felt would seep their way through. And they voted for all of that to kind of stay on course. So what does this mandate mean? 303 seats in parliament, a very clear majority, 353 for the NDA. One would be kind of very easily able to think about this as a mandate for change. But Mr. Modi, like any other innovator, is faced with a unique dilemma. Does he keep doing what he does that got him back into power, or does he change? And if he does change, what does that mean? How does he tweak his message? Now, he's an extremely adept, very flexible, agile communicator, politician. In his 3-4 stints as the Gujarat Chief Minister, we saw him kind of transform from a nationalist to a pro-business to a good governance advocate, and that is going to be similar, we think, with his second stint as the Prime Minister. There are significant learnings from his first stint, like front-loading painful reform. I think he left IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, as well as the GST, and even demonetization to probably the latter half of his first term, which meant that people were still feeling the pinch, so to say, leading into the elections, which kind of called to question a lot of the economic fundamentals on which the economy were resting. Be that as it may, the social program was enough to carry him across the line and then some. But we think that a lot of the kind of reform will come in the first half. I think moving on to kind of what the modified India would look like, we think that populism and reform are going to go hand in hand. Mr. Modi has proven to be an incremental driver of change rather than a radical driver of change. Having said that, he is given to taking calculated risks, as we saw with the demonetization, as well as with surgical strikes and others. But he's fundamentally somebody who knows that changing the system will take time, and he's grown in savvy, as is his party and the coalition, in being able to drive the right kind of outcomes. We'll talk about the budget session of Parliament and the legislative intensity that drove and what that means. But fundamentally, a modified India would be an India which we think would be bringing together populism with reform. So social programs like affordable housing, Ujjwala was the LED program, Ujjwala is the LPG gas program, Swachh Bharat, which is the sanitation program, and Ayushman Bharat, which is which is the largest health insurance scheme in the world, which he announced in the last year of his first term. Will also grow with piped water for the first time in a rather interesting and quite path-breaking move. He's brought together multiple ministries and departments that manage the water resources of India, and he's committed to delivering piped water to every household, 180 odd million across India by 2024, as also power, which is again in urban India almost a given, but still a bridge too far, a mile too far in many parts of rural India. We also think that the IBC, the strengthening of that code to ensure the pains from it, especially for MSMEs, is eased out, as also pruning of bank sector debt will be high on his agenda, and he's already made some moves to that end. Infrastructure investment has always been a BJP priority, and even with the first NDA government, 1999 to 2004, the National Highway Association, Authority of India, and other infrastructure leading departments found a great deal of impetus and accelerated growth there. So we continue to expect to see that. I think the streamlining of GST and the direct tax reform will be a little bit of a slower progress, but it's very high on the government's agenda. The 1 lakh crore target per month for GST collections has been a hit and miss over the past year or so. There is also a great deal of pain that certainly MSMEs and even exporters are feeling about GST refunds, which SOPs announced in August, the Finance Ministry and other departments have committed to accelerating. But it'll still take a fair while to do because of the need to get state consensus on GST specifically. And also there are existential economic concerns which we feel will define a lot of the kind of moves that are made. And we'll talk about the economic situation in the country in a couple of slides. Divestment and subsidy rationalization will be very high on the Prime Minister's and the BJP's agenda. They are, don't get me wrong, they are fundamentally an organization or a party that believes that a well-performing public sector organization should be given its leeway. I think all the oil PSUs kind of ratify that stand, and it's very much been the stand of governments across over the years. But it also recognizes that there are many other public sector undertakings, not to say the least Air India and others who could benefit from the divestment. And I think some of the learnings from Modi 1.0 will be used to push that forward. Anything that can help the government drive up non-tax revenues, and divestment is very high on that list, will be pulled as a lever. Anti-corruption drives will continue. But having said that, there has been a bit of a backlash around what is being referred to as tax terrorism, and the government is very keen to ensure that it doesn't become anti-entrepreneur or anti-business in the way that that is being executed. But corruption remains very high on Mr. Modi's agenda. A lot of the legislation from Modi from Modi 1.0, including the Prevention of Corruption Act amendments and so on and so forth, have helped push that message. What we think is less likely to happen are land and labor reforms, which are not just thorny subjects, but also subjects that require a lot of state intervention, participation, and initiative as well. And it is likely that the central government is going to leave that to the states to sort out. It may mean that the big drivers, the levers of economic reform may remain untapped for the near term, but will also depend on what the economic performance is over the next 6 to 12 months to see how badly they want to push on with that. Make in India continues to not gain traction, but there are many fundamental reasons why, partly to do with international trade and India's slight lethargy in being able to take on the opportunity that presents itself with the China-US standoff. Suffice to say that other nations, specifically Vietnam, seem to have been faster to fill that particular vacuum, which may mean that India may have missed the boat. Having said that, the manufacturing sector in India has grown, but not in more recent times, as evidenced by the latest GDP numbers, which seem to show a more sobering picture. Moving on, I think the 100-day report card was very much a kind of action-packed one. Bank recapitalization and just correcting or providing banks the opportunity to kind of become more credit-friendly, especially to MSMEs, is very high on the government's agenda. The dividends from the RBI, which were much reviled, are expected to be used to not just manage fiscal deficit numbers, which are very critical because that impacts ratings and investments and so on and so forth for all of us, are going to be used also for bank recapitalization, we think. Article 370 and Article 35 in Jammu and Kashmir was done decisively and talks about what is possible if you have political capital and you have expressed ideas and ideals to this effect for a long time, which meant that the government was able to kind of drive that forward. The contentious citizenship exercise in Assam has raised more questions, but also speaks to the muscular nationalism that the government is willing to try out. Having said that, as many of you will know, the outcomes from the NRC exercise haven't quite satisfied anybody, including the government, and so it remains to be seen whether that is something that the government will continue to pursue. The Parliament's extended budget session was probably one of the most productive sessions in independent India's history. I think 36 bills passed through the Lok Sabha, 30 through Rajya Sabha, and many of them drive the government's social, economic, and political agenda forward. The kind of emergence of enforcement and enforcement activism, as we refer to, or as we like to refer to it, is going to be a significant kind of concern, or the other bookend, if you will, that most businesses will start kind of thinking about, or should start thinking about, because we are seeing all regulators across the board getting a lot more teeth and being encouraged to do more to ensure that greater efficiency is brought into the Indian system, primarily to take content with corruption, but also to ensure that the right kind of best practices and means of doing business are being followed. In Mr. Modi's words, the first 100 days were development, trust, and big changes heavy. But suffice to say that Mr. Modi himself remains a persona whose legend continues to grow. It is his 69th birthday today, so I'd like to wish him a very happy birthday. And of course, the nation celebrates with him as well. The economic deceleration, just to kind of start bringing this to a close, the economic deceleration doesn't sit very well with Modi's kind of defined aim for India to become a US dollar 5 trillion economy by 2024. And we've talked about what is needed for India to grow to that number in the next 5 years. There is some contention that that might be possible, but I think there is universal acknowledgement that the country will do well with having that kind of a vision defined. One of the first things that may seem to be a dampener is the kind of economic deceleration. India's GDP numbers for the first quarter were 5%. This was after a 5.8%, which was also relatively low in the Jan to March quarter. And this is our worst performance as a nation in the last 20 years by way of quarterly GDP growth. Consumption slowdown is a significant cause of concern. As we know, India's economy is fundamentally driven by internal consumption, and it's not so much an export-driven economy. And a slowdown across the board, right from biscuits to automotives, if you will, has led to some concern. There's also a significant liquidity crunch because, obviously, with the drying out of capital in the market because of not just the banks facing their fair share of NDAs, but also NBFCs, the non-banking financial companies, facing an alarming collapse potentially. There is significant lack of credit available to especially the MSME sector, which is the beating heart of the Indian economy. Startups and entrepreneurs continue to have a tricky time navigating the regulatory environment. Even though the angel tax was withdrawn, there are other significant concerns which seemed to keep entrepreneurs just that little bit unhappy about whether they're truly getting the support from the government that they want. We all know about the automotive sales story. It is quite dampening as an impact, as not just because it's a bellwether sector, but also because it is a sector that has multiplier effect on jobs, investments, as well as the economy as a whole. The manufacturing output picked up in July, but we think that's a temporary blip, potentially leading into the hope that there will be a greater demand coming into the festive season in October, but that may or may not carry forward, given that some of the kind of more endemic issues exist. Growth, we think, will continue to be driven by services. Fintech, agrotech, infotech continue to be primary drivers. There is still investment money going into that. There is belief within the government that greater efficiencies can be driven into the Indian economy, even though it hasn't been such a significant adopter of legacy technology, if you will. But I think the government's program, which was kind of catchily paraphrased as JAM, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, which fundamentally was led on the back of the significant growth in smartphones and the telecom revolution in India, means that more and more people have the ability to access services, and therefore a lot more, and not just consumer to consumer companies, but also business to business and government to citizen services are being rolled out. And we think that will drive a lot of investment, valuation, and potential growth opportunities. Credit lending, as we mentioned, continues to be an issue, and it hasn't taken off despite the government trying multiple things to boost lending, and that may be down to the fact that there is a significant underlying concern as to whether the banking sector is truly capable of supporting India's growth ambitions. So just to kind of wrap up the first 4 or 5 slides, the government came in and started off on the 30th of May, finished 100 days on the 7th to the 8th of September, presented a very half and half kind of a budget. It laid out a vision, but didn't quite lay out a roadmap. The fiscal deficit target of 3.3 was very heartening because it meant that the government was very conscious that it couldn't spend its way out of either a slowdown or to growth. They understand that infrastructure remains a key sector, and therefore 100 trillion have been committed over the next 5 years, which again will require a lot of international investment into it, as evidenced not just by the NIIF structure, which is 49% government owned, but 51% invites investment and commitments from external wealth funds and others. Moves in divestment, affordable housing, water, and budget in the budget were quite progressive. And with the legislations that were passed, it meant that the budget session was quite intense and laid the groundwork for the next 5 years. But of course, to become a $5 trillion economy, economists conservatively suggest that we have to grow at 9% per annum of real growth, which means before inflation, we're looking at about 13.5%, which is quite a significant number given where we stand right now. Investment rates have to be to the tune of 40% of GDP. We are significantly lower than that, as also banking lending rates to be 20% or more. So overall, the assessment is that while it's a great vision statement and it powers the country forward, there are some significant bottlenecks that could potentially hold us back. I think in the kind of immediate term, slowing wage growth, decreasing private investment, slowdown in consumption all around, the kind of broadly negative financial market sentiment, as well as the need to recapitalize banks and continue to provide new avenues to credit for MSMEs is going to mean that there are more challenges than not. But the government will continue to play an outsized role, which has proven to be helpful because for sectors and areas of focus, that has meant rapid implementation, fast growth, and ongoing reform in those areas. The government should continue to take calculated risks. While I'm not predicting a demon kind of an event, we should be open to the fact that Mr. Modi will continue to be aggressive as opportunity presents itself. But he also understands the need for foreign investment. The money to drive India's next phase of growth will come as much from international investment as it will come from within India, and so that's a key driver. And local and state issues are going to be as critical as the centre's promises. Just to kind of wrap things up, a couple of slides. The key milestones leading up to 2024. We think that from a political point of view, corruption. So if you look at it, corruption will be a key mandate for the government to contend with. Mr. Modi himself and BJP broadly believes that that is an endemic issue, and they are committed to rooting out the canker. They also believe in kind of the weaponization of nationalism. BJP is fundamentally a right-wing party that identifies as a very solid base to appease and contend with, and so that will continue to be a key consideration as they move forward. And the citizenship registration program will continue to drive a lot of the kind of tactics by which that may be delivered. From a legislative point of view, we spoke about what the Rajya Sabha majority would mean, but we also spoke about the Prime Minister and the BJP understanding that balancing local priorities at the state level will be very key to becoming an easier to do business with country, and foreign investors are beginning to understand that and understand that it is no longer just about the center, but also about what happens at the state level. From a geopolitical point of view, friendships are being reaffirmed. I think India's never had a better relationship with the Gulf nations than under Mr. Modi, which runs quite counter to his right-wing national position. But the fact is that energy security and the opportunity that India presents in the long term provides more of a win-win story. Equally, there is opportunity with the US-China trade wars that India is keen to capitalize on. And India will continue to see the US and France as one of its kind of key partners. UK is in balance for more reasons than ones that I would like to get into in this seminar. But I imagine that once the dust is settled, so to say, after the 31st of October, we expect to see an acceleration in that as well, because there is a natural, I think Chris mentioned the living bridge, there is a natural alignment between the UK and India that should reaffirm that economic opportunity. Just in kind of closing, we speak about the importance of watching the enforcement climate. It is very significantly important to the government because they want to drive greater efficiencies into the economy. So companies are well advised. We are speaking to all our clients and prospects about the need to watch that, the integrity risks, and by that I mean the need to watch compliance among third parties, related party risks, and so on and so forth. And we also kind of talk about an inconsistent policy environment between center and the state, but also between from the center itself. And so the need to kind of understand in more detail than not what specifically impacts your particular sector and your particular industry is very, very important. We spoke about the federal state cooperation, so I won't go into that, as well as the kind of need for decentralized and local priorities. The information environment, there is a great deal of hype around certain sectors, and it is important for investors to kind of distill the reality from there as they look across their ecosystem. As they look at all their stakeholders, it is more important today than in previous years to understand very clearly what impact that they may have and how it is that you plan your business along with them, so as to ensure that you're able to meet your business targets. The need for operational risk awareness in India today is higher than ever, and I will close with that and take any questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Amit, for a very interesting and detailed presentation. I think it's always difficult to actually take this huge topic and distill it down into such a concise presentation. So thank you very much for that. I think as we sort of look now, so anybody who is watching, please feel free. You're more than welcome to ask any questions through the platform. But I've sort of got a few as sort of chairman's privilege to start off with. So UK IBC now have been running our Ease of Doing Business report for 4 years. We're about to launch our 5th report. Obviously, hugely successful report, so much so now that the World Bank is now partnering us on our latest report on that. I think we all know that India's risen significantly in terms of the ease of doing business global rankings from 70 odd places. One of the areas you touched on there was about the challenge between sort of national government and then state by state.
Yeah.
And one of the things that our members are constantly telling us is that one of the key challenges for them is the difference between state to state, where maybe a license may take 200 days in one state and the neighbouring state takes sort of 20 days. So in terms of what your clients are saying, is there any area that you feel that Mr. Modi should push on more in terms of the ease of doing business, which would have a greater impact?
Yeah, so I think one of the kind of big drivers for his political economy has been the GST. So
yes.
The GST, the One Nation, One Tax program, effectively is not just about simplification of the indirect tax treaty, but also a realignment of the center-state relationship. The way the government, the central government, accrues that tax and then pays back the state has become or is evolving into a win-win situation, where he is driving that need for greater equalization across the board. And
okay.
So that's essentially the first salvo, if you will, to try and kind of equalize the way that business is done across India. It will take a long time, and like I mentioned, it will continue to be driven by state privileges. The Constitution defines, the state list, the concurrent list, and the central list, and that will continue to be the privilege of the states. But with his political agenda of kind of ruling in as many states as the BJP and allies ruling in as many states as possible, but also kind of defining that uniform one nation economic floor, if you will, we think that will be the interstate differences will even out over a period of time.
Do you think that opening up, one of the recommendations that we made last time was that drilling down the ease of business indices down to a state level? I'm a firm believer in open information, and therefore, I believe that if you actually started to publish this data between state to state, then no chief minister is going to want to be at the bottom of a list, and therefore that will drive through. But again, what we're seeing is there is maybe a little bit too much competition between the states, and therefore the ability to take best practice from one state might not reflect over. Do you think that will have a sort of greater impact on businesses in the states?
Like you mentioned, competitive federalism is now a reality in India. States are putting up their best face to investors and understand that they're competing against the neighbor. I don't believe that will in any way stop states from adopting best practices from other states. In fact, we've seen that across the board. I mean, and again, the BJP becoming the kind of party in power across many states across India is helping. For instance, when we saw Rajasthan taking on a lot of kind of Gujarat's best practices, it was quite evident that there is a greater degree of acceptance.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, the states recognize that if they do well economically, and governments recognize that if they do well economically, and if they provide for their states, and if they provide for the citizens, good governance in that sense is beginning to get acknowledged and appreciated in India much more than has been in the past. And I think even if you can look beyond the BJP, Mr. Naveen Patnaik and the way that he's managed the social and economic affairs in Odisha has meant that he's now been in power for 19 years, coming on to 20 years, and continues to be, he will stay in power till 2024, we know that, because he just won himself a significant mandate. And that's saying something. So good governance will pay dividends, and the states are very open to learning from each other.
That's fantastic. As I say, we're still open to any questions. So if anybody wants to put any through, please type them through and we'll ask them to our experts. And just sort of turning over then, James, in terms of sort of there was mention there about data. Obviously, data localism is a big area. Our members, when it first came out, were very nervous about data localism and whether that meant that a lot of maybe the big banks would have to start opening brand new data centers in India, etc. Are you still seeing from your side on the sort of the data, the cyber side, is that one of the key things that businesses will look at as a risk when they're entering into India?
I think so, and I think increasingly, but I don't think that stands in any real difference to the way that organisations are looking at emerging opportunities in other parts of the world as well. I think, broadly speaking, we're seeing much tighter data security globally at the moment, more proactive law enforcement. India.
That's because there's been quite a few high-profile cases recently where I think now people are saying the reputational damage it has. Obviously, we've had quite a few here in the UK with a major airline, with major telecoms. I think that's affected the way people now look at it.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of this is driven by what is a increased threat environment on cyber side. It's also driven clearly by regulatory pressure to enshrine data privacy rights much more clearly within national legislation. The interesting kind of way that India has looked at this is that they've chosen to pursue more of a kind of GDPR-like basis for that, rather than the kind of control of data that you see in China with the Chinese cybersecurity law. That still presents challenges to companies in the way that they manage and process and host their data in a jurisdiction like India, but it does probably mean that it will feel more familiar to organisations in that it is more GDPR-like, as we also see in markets like Brazil, than what is confronting companies when they are seeking to do business and manage supply chains in parts of the world like China. But I think from a data privacy standpoint, there is a sometimes inherent tension between a desire to protect data with the issues that we've seen around the right to be forgotten in India. But I think the good the perspective that we have on this is that overall, the fact that India is choosing to kind of pursue more of a GDPR style regime for that is probably overall a good thing for the business environment, and a less complicating factor for companies in the way that they manage their
more comfortable to something they know, and we've all been through the pain of GDPR, so therefore.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's fantastic.
If I may just add,
of course.
In addition to the kind of business and personal tensions that exist, between monetization and being forgotten, there's also a very significant driver in India specifically, which was Supreme Court legislating the fundamental right to privacy. In 2017, when they did that, that's what initiated the Justice Sri Krishna Committee to be put together, and the report that came out last year kind of contends with those two parallel tensions, and recognizes that. And that report is going to define the Indian Personal Data Protection Act, which we expect will kind of be submitted into Parliament in the winter session, because it is such a high priority for this government and the minister. The fundamental driver is as much kind of judicial impetus that the fundamental right to privacy was given, and then to be using the GDPR framework kernel to kind of define an Indian version of
it's a very difficult balance, isn't it? We'll still go through iterations of change throughout the time. I think just to sort of to finish off then, you mentioned obviously we all know that India is driving towards a $5 trillion economy. I think you mentioned there in your presentation that means it needs to grow at 13%. So given the sort of, the conflicting numbers that go out depending upon you ask in terms of growth in India, do you think that that's a reality now? And then just sort of finally, what do you think that the Indian government has to do as to the number one thing in terms of being able to attract the levels of FDI that it would need to achieve that?
I think 5 trillion, even when it was announced, the very day when it was announced, was commended by much of industry and a lot of
Actually, by
investors.
2030, isn't it?
2024.
2024, sorry.
2024.
Because actually will come, it's just a question of
Exactly
what the date's going to be.
That's exactly the point I'm making. It was commended by the industry and by investors because it set a vision for India.
Yeah.
And we haven't historically ever set ourselves a target. Now, if you bear in mind the fact that India and China, for instance, in the early 80s were exactly the same, 0.2 trillion. And China are what they are, which is 14 trillion today, and we are 2.6, 2.7 trillion. The fact is that those kind of trajectories and numbers are possible. Now, India needs to do a lot, land, labor, capital being primary reform areas, to be able to meet those kind of growth numbers.
Yeah.
Is it possible? Possibly, but potentially not. Yeah. Even so, even if it is not 2024, even if it is slightly later in that decade, at least it provides the industry and the investors a kind of, a North Star, if you will, to push towards, to kind of push forward with. And there is a recognition that even if the land, labor, capital kind of trifecta are not really addressed, if we were to address the infrastructure pieces and the taxation pieces, there would be immediate relief that would come to, so this answers your second question, there would be immediate relief that would come to potential investors who would find it easier to, for instance, get their money in, get their money out, and so on and so forth, which will be quite definitive in helping push India's attractiveness as a market forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, a huge thank you to everybody who's attended this session. This has been recorded, so we will be sending it out as well with obviously copies of the presentation for you to reflect and review back. You will see on your screens there are the Twitter accounts, so we're at UKIBC and control risks at control_risks. I'm Chris Hayes, so I'm at Chris Hayes 4 if you want to send any feedback. And also if you've got any feedback on this session, or if you would like to suggest any future topics, if you send those through to us at events@ukibc.com. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.